I just need my paper. Can I take it with me? Yeah. All right, some minor technical difficulties. Okay. So back to a little bit about me. I have also spent the last 8 years as an OT consultant here at the Center for Autism, and I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist, and have worked as an MFT in a community mental health agency for the past 10 years. So before we jump into the main topic of our presentation, I thought it would be helpful for us to talk a little bit about the Center for Autism and give some background about that. So the Center for Autism is a nonprofit organization located in Philadelphia, and it was founded in 1955 by a child psychiatrist named Dr. Bertram A. Ruttenberg, who has been a pioneer in the field of autism. We are proud to say that the Center for Autism is the oldest autism treatment center in the country. Our mission here at the Center for Autism is to improve the quality of life for individuals with autism spectrum disorders and their families. We currently have 2 sites in the Philadelphia region and offer a variety of treatment options, including intake and evaluation, early childhood services, adolescent and early adulthood services, family services, outpatient therapy, and trainings for the community. The center uses a unique evidence-based approach that looks at the whole child. Our treatment approach pulls from various empirically supported clinical theories, including relationship-based interventions, infant and child mental health, child development theory, social learning theory, attachment theory, and behaviorism. Our main focus today is going to be on the Tasting Time program, which is a part of our early childhood program. So the early childhood program consists of 3 separate and unique programs. They are the pre-K program, the First Friends program, and the Early Explorers program. So a little bit about each of those programs. All of them are year-round, Monday through Friday, 9 to 2, and are for children with an ASD diagnosis. And the children that we serve are between the ages of 2.5 and 6 years old in that early childhood program. The pre-K program has a 2-to-1 child-to-staff ratio. Within a program room of 8 children of similar developmental levels, the children participate in structured activities designed to target their individualized goals. And the primary curriculum that's used in the early childhood program is a combination of RDI and DIR floor time. The First Friends program has a 3-to-1 child-staff ratio, and a child in the First Friends program has to have strong communicative intent, an awareness of peers in their environment, and the ability to interact with an adult or peer. So those children typically are a little bit more high functioning than the children in the pre-K program. And the primary curriculum for First Friends is called Conscious Discipline. And the Early Explorers program has a 2-to-1 child-to-staff ratio. Each program room has only 4 children and 2 therapists, and was designed for children who may need more intensive support. This program also has a strong family component with a weekly educational group for families, and their primary curriculum is Floor Time DIR. This program was recently discontinued, unfortunately. So occupational and speech therapy are integrated into the child's treatment, but are provided as a consultative service rather than direct therapy. So now that you have some information about the Center for Autism, let's move on to talking about tasting time and feeding and eating challenges in autism. So on the first slide, these are the 3 learning objectives that we have for the audience today. We would like, by the end of the talk, for the audience to be able to identify common challenges with feeding and eating in children with autism, explain at least 2 strategies that can assist a child who has challenges with feeding and eating, and for them to be able to describe the tasting time intervention for clients at the Center for Autism. So a little bit about the history of tasting time. The Tasting Time program was originally developed by the late Rose Cavalli, who was an occupational therapist here at the Center for Autism. And she developed what was then called the snack program as a way to introduce and expose foods to our children that they may not normally eat. In 2014, a group called the Tasting Time Committee was developed in an effort to revamp the snack program in order to make it more effective and beneficial for the children. Tasting Time, as we know it now, evolved from the efforts of this committee, and this committee involved myself as the occupational therapist, my colleagues Brittany Johansson and Chris Vigiano. Chris is a speech therapist, and Brittany is the other occupational therapist here at the Center for Autism. And we also had some representatives from the program rooms, so the actual therapists that work in the program rooms with the children, who are called mental health therapists. Those therapists typically have backgrounds in psychology, social work, and special ed. Okay, so we will talk more about the specifics of tasting time in a few minutes, but first let's go into some of the feeding and eating challenges that children with autism may have. So this slide here is just a visual representation of some of the, sorry, let me go back. Okay, some of the eating and feeding challenges that children with autism may have. So you can see that children with autism may have impairments in motor and sensory processing that may impact their ability to eat and to take part in mealtime routines. They may refuse food, so we see that commonly where we have children who exhibit food refusal. They may be very selective about the types of foods that they want to eat, or the textures of foods that they want to eat, and they may be very rigid around mealtime routines. Okay, this slide goes a little bit more in depth into the different areas of difficulty that children with autism may have when it comes to eating and feeding. So the first area of difficulty is that the motor and sensory impairments that they have. So this may be displayed or may be exhibited by difficulty using utensils and preferring to eat with their hands. This is a common thing for a lot of our children. You might see children who have some oral motor sensitivity, and they may not like having certain textures near their mouth. For example, some kids might not like a metal spoon. They might want to use like a plastic coated spoon instead because of the texture or the feel of the spoon on their mouth. And then also under this area of difficulty, you may have children who are really active and are unable to sit for meals because of their high activity level. With food refusal, this is typically a refusal to eat all or most foods presented. And these children typically limit their food selection to 10 to 15 foods or less. A lot of times they're unable to maintain appropriate growth and might be actually under the care of a doctor because of that. They might refuse to eat food from one or more food groups. They may demonstrate problem behaviors during eating, such as choking, gagging, or tantrums. And so if those behaviors happen, you definitely want to refer the child to a medical specialist for further testing in order to determine if there's a medical reason for the choking and gagging, because it's always good just to rule that out. And if it is one of those things, then the medical specialist can help with taking care of that. You may see children with food jags, which are an insistence that one or more specific foods be present at every meal and be prepared in the same way each time. So an example of this is we had one child who really liked takeout pizza and only would eat pizza if it came in a pizza box. So the parents were very adaptive and would present the child with the pizza in a pizza box that they kept to kind of help, deal with that food refusal issue. And then you may also see something called food neophobia, which is a reluctance to eat new foods. Okay, so the third area of difficulty is food selectivity by type. So these are children who might eat a narrow range of food that may be nutritionally inappropriate. So these kids might be described as picky eaters. They may accept 20 or more different foods, and they're usually able to maintain appropriate growth, but they might only like to eat things that are really salty. That seems to be something that a lot of children with autism crave, is that salt. So they'll eat a lot of chips and things like that. And then the next area of difficulty is a food selectivity by texture. So these are kids who refuse to eat developmentally appropriate food textures. And it's often very sensory based, and they also often tend to prefer soft or pureed foods. And the last area of difficulty is around mealtime routines. So children with autism tend to be very rigid, and so a lot of times they want to adhere to certain routines that may directly affect the family mealtime routine. And so this could mean they want certain foods served and are really upset if those specific foods are not served. They may want specific people to do specific parts of the preparation of the meal, There may be rigidity around seating arrangements, and they may be very rigid around the time of when the meal takes place. Okay, so this next slide is a visual depiction of some of the interventions for feeding and eating in children with autism. For the sake of time, we're going to focus specifically today on the motor and sensory impairments, as well as the challenges around mealtime routine. So the first area of difficulty is those motor and sensory impairments. So how do you intervene when you have children who are unable to participate in mealtime because of motor and sensory challenges? The first intervention is around children who have that oral motor sensitivity. So one of the things that you might want to do is give parents or give staff different mouthing toys that you can use with the children around other times besides mealtime to help decrease some of that oral motor sensitivity. So some examples of some toys that we have suggested are things like bubbles, whistles, and chewies, just to try to get some of that oral motor sensitivity decreased a little bit. If you have children who are really distractible and have a high level of activity, there are some movement strategies that can be used to help decrease that. So if you have somebody who's overly active, you might want to give them some movement breaks. You might want to give them a movement break prior to the meal to help them to get some of that movement out. But also there are some kids who are really struggle with sitting for an entire meal. So they might need movement breaks throughout the meal, like eat something, go have a movement break, and then come back and eat some more. Calming activities such as wheelbarrow walking, wall push-ups, and arranging chairs around the table can be done before the meal. And those are all activities that provide proprioceptive input, which is often very calming for children. Okay, and then if you want to work on increasing a child's ability to remain seated at the table, you really want to look at your expectations around this and begin with short time expectations. So for example, starting with 5 minutes, and then also being aware and paying attention that the expectation for the length of sitting should match the child's attention span. You want to reward and praise any efforts and any successes. So if the child stays seated for the designated period of time, praise them and allow them a chance to leave the table if necessary. And then you want to gradually build up to the expected time interval required to eat based on the child's age. Okay, so the development of behavioral guidelines. So it's always helpful if children can actually participate in the development of a set of rules to be used during the mealtime. And we've done this a lot with some of our rooms that have some more higher functioning children. It helps to kind of increase the buy-in for the children if they actually participated in setting up the rules that are used during mealtime. And so you can write these rules out, and they might include things such as the food stays on the plate, a spoon is to be used instead of fingers, the child will stay in the seat until the timer rings, and the child will take the plate to the sink when mealtime is finished. Behavioral rules should be age appropriate, so it's really important to kind of think about like where your children are, not just chronologically, but also developmentally, and make sure that you develop the rules around that. So a preschool child should be expected to sit at a table for 15 minutes instead of 30 minutes, and that's really important to take into account. Okay, so later on we will also describe the expectations and rules that we develop for tasting time here at the Center for Autism. The next intervention is being able to allow the children to choose plates and cups and utensils. So much of the rigidity that children with autism have around mealtime has to do with control. And so giving them some control within reason is really important. So we do provide children with the opportunity to maybe pick what color plate, cup, or utensil they want to use. And this helps them to make choices within a flexible structure. And then incorporating food throughout programming. So giving children a chance to practice without the stress and anxiety that often accompanies mealtime is really important. So when parents are sitting down with a child and trying to get them to eat because they want them to get a certain amount of calories in or for nutritional value, there's a lot of stress and anxiety that's involved with that. So if we can have children play with food or talk about food at times when that anxiety is not there, the theory is that it will help to decrease the anxiety when they are sitting down for a mealtime. So plastic food can be used in play activities. You can read books about food and nutrition, and you can sing songs or recite nursery rhymes about food. Okay, so also sometimes it might be hard for children with autism to transition to the table for mealtime. So you can use things like a timer to give them like a visual picture of how long it's going to take or how many more minutes they have before they're going to be expected to transition to the table for mealtime. You can use a social story or a picture schedule also to kind of prepare the children visually for the meal that's about to come up. Food preparation, so again, including the child in food prep and presentation always helps with buy-in and also might alleviate anxiety produced by mealtime. Social stories are great. We use them a lot here at the center. Social stories are a story with pictures that can be used to describe expectations of mealtime participation, and the goal is to improve the mealtime skills and decrease disruptive behavior around mealtime. Power cards are also a really nice technique. So these are cards that have a picture of someone who is influential to the child, who describes a desired behavior for the child to perform. So an example of that might be a picture of a child's favorite superhero used to demonstrate the steps of mealtime. And then video self-modeling. We know that children with autism are visual learners, so video self-modeling is a good way to build on that strength. And all that is just videoing the child engaged in appropriate mealtime behavior. And this can promote skills acquisition, as well as the maintenance and transference of skills across people and settings. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Vigiano, who is going to talk a little bit more about the Tasting Time program.
Okay, thank you, Heather. My name is Chris Vigiano. I am a speech therapist. I've been a speech therapist for 34 years. Most of that time I've been in pediatrics. Most of my feeding experience has been with children with severe motor difficulties, also kids with developmental disabilities, including autism. Um, Most of that time has been in educational settings, and for the last 3 years, I've had the pleasure of being at the Center for Autism, which, as Heather described, is a little bit different because it's a mental health setting. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about um, what the setup is like. I did go the wrong way. Sorry about that. Um, Children with autism are more likely to be picky eaters or problem eaters. The increased occurrence of food refusal, limited food repertoires, um, and it seems like repeated exposure to new foods can increase that food acceptance. One of the things that we wanted to emphasize is that when we originally conceived of doing tasting time here, it was an activity that we had included as part of the programming day for the kids. And we had wanted to find some way to address some of those feeding issues within the mental health setting. Um, so what we did was we devised an activity, and then eventually we decided that we wanted to look at those activities and see how effective they were. So I think it's really important to remember that we did not design this as a study. We actually designed it as an activity and then decided to look at it and see how we could improve it. And the way we decided to do it, we're going to describe what the activity looked like in the center, and then my colleague Brittany Johansson will come on and describe what we did to try to figure out what was working and what wasn't working for us. Okay, so the methods and the purposes of tasting time. We wanted to expose the kids to a variety of tastes and textures. Um, Naturally, many of the clients are picky eaters. Everyone has a diagnosis of autism. So it's not surprising to us that we had a high percentage of kids that fit that description. Um, Hold on a second. I think I'm a little bit, I think I have to figure out which number slide I'm on. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Um, what we did was we looked at how we could set up the um, tasting time protocol. We looked at a variety of ways to do that, and we examined the literature. And we decided to use the USDA Choose My Plate program to select which foods we would be using. And what it does is it looks at the nutritional aspects of various developmental um, levels, and it gave us an idea of which way to go in terms of how we were going to select which foods to target during tasting time. Um, what we found in the literature is that it helps with multiple exposures, at least 20 exposures for each new food. Will encourage kids to try it. Um, when we looked at the way they had divided up the foods, we thought that that was the way to go. We originally thought that we would do fruits, vegetables, grains, protein, and dairy. What we found is that we were running into problems with kids with allergies in the protein area, so we did eventually substitute a carbohydrate into that rotation. Each presentation of the new food was held for 2 weeks. Our kids come to the center 5 days a week. So that was 10 presentations during that 2 week period. And we would run through the 5 areas and then start the rotation again. So eventually they would get 20 exposures to each food. We also sent home a family survey, and we got a really good response with that. And we found that a lot of the families did cite the same foods over and over again, so we tried to incorporate that into our tasting time rotation. And also, we found that a lot of families were identifying foods that were familiar with holidays, and we also tried to accommodate that aspect of it. Okay, then we had to set up some general expectations for tasting time. We expected that, or hoped that all of the kids would start to sit at the table with the food, that they would explore the food either through touch or taste, and that they would leave the food on the table. So kids that were swiping, we were hoping that we would see a decline or an elimination of that kind of behavior. Um, For the higher level kids, we decided that we would, in addition to those basic expectations, we would have them help with the food prep and the food cleanup, that they would work on self-feeding skills using utensils, using language to socially do things like refuse or ask for more food, and that they would share foods family style. We want to show you an example of one of the um, new food presentation activities that we had. Um, so if you look at this one, this is our rotation for cheese, and it covers the 5 days of the week. And what we tried to do is come up with different activities so that the kids could explore the foods in different ways over the course of the week and hopefully taste them And if they didn't taste them, at least they would have some fun becoming familiar and tolerating the food. As you can see on here, on Monday, there is an activity where we make a moon snack, and that involves spreading cream cheese on a rice cracker and putting Cheerios on it to make it look like the moon. Um, and in that instance, we're trying to pair something that's familiar, like Cheerios, with cream cheese, and see if that would help um, the children become more familiar with it. On Tuesday, American cheese and cookie cutters, just kind of a fun activity that incorporates shapes, which a lot of our kids do like. On Wednesday, we did towers using cubes of cheese, maybe stacking them as if they were blocks and hopefully eating them. On Thursday, making snowmen on crackers using Parmesan cheese. And on Friday, cream cheese with taco cheese mixed in to use as a dip with tortilla chips. So we just try to vary the activity every day. Hopefully, if one day doesn't work for a given child, the next day will. And as Heather described, we try to give the mental health therapists in the room some strategies that they could use, um, namely giving the child control over which plate to use. A lot of kids will have preference over material or color for the utensils or the plate. Reading books about food or about nutritional kinds of topics, singing songs, nursery rhymes about food, using a timer or a picture schedule so that they know what to expect during the tasting time activity, and using social stories to prepare the child for the meal. One of the things that we didn't mention is that our expectation is that tasting time should take no more than about 10 to 15 minutes at the most. And we do encourage, if it winds up not taking all that time, we encourage the staff to end the activity and focus on advancing those skills at some later date. Some of the other strategies that we included, um, as Heather said, setting up the rules, either writing them out or maybe using a picture schedule um, to delineate what kind of expectations we're hoping to see, including the child and the preparation of the food. That's always a good idea with any kind of feeding intervention. Using video modeling um, so that the kids can either see themselves or peers engaging in a beneficial activity with the food. When possible, having the staff model eating the food for the children. And if a child has difficulty sitting for meal times, consider an alternative to actually sitting in a chair. So that's kind of an overview of what it looks like at the Center for Autism. And my colleague Brittany is going to explain some of the ways we tried to look at what we had done with tasting time and try to improve it through um, a couple of assessments and comparing uh, all the data points that we had collected regarding the food.
Okay. All right. So my name is Brittany Johansson. I'm an occupational therapist, and I have been working for a little more than 2 years now. I'm an occupational therapy consultant here at the Center for Autism, and then I also I work as an occupational therapist in early intervention in Philadelphia, working with kids who are babies, so from birth to 3 years old. Um, so I actually want to just go back a few slides just to review what our study questions were, because I know it's a few slides back. Okay, so um,
just to review, so this is a preliminary study. So this is exploratory, just an exploratory study on measuring outcomes for this program that has been here at the center for a few years. So we had two things that we wanted to look at. The first variable we wanted to see was related to the acceptance of new foods. So we wanted to see if there was an increase in the acceptance of new foods after participating in tasting time. And then we also wanted to look at mealtime behaviors and see if there's an improvement in mealtime behaviors after participating in tasting time. So just to keep those two questions in mind. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to our methods, and I'm going to talk more about what our participant characteristics look like. So we had a total of 17 participants in our study, so our N was 17. The mean age of the participants were 52.53 months, with a standard deviation of 7.67 months. The range for the ages was 39 to 65 months old. We had 82.35% males and 17.65% females. With race, we had 64.71% African American participants, 17.65% other participants, 11.76% participants were Hispanic or Latino, and 5.88% were white or Caucasian, and we had no Asian participants. All of the participants were diagnosed with autism, and then some had some other diagnoses that you can see on the left-hand side. All the participants were from Philadelphia, and then we also had participants from all the different programs in early childhood at the Center for Autism. So we wanted to include participants from all the programs just to get an inclusive representation of the center's population. And just so everyone knows, tasting time was conducted the same way across all the different programs and across the different sites. So we had Tiger Room, which was a pre-K room at our Grant location. Penguin Room was a pre-K room at our Ford location. Then we had Wolf Room, which was a First Friends room. And then we had Kangaroo Room, which was an Early Explorers room. So Grant only has pre-K, only had a pre-K program at the time, and Ford had the other three. So that's why Ford has First Friends and Early Explorers. So basically, Tiger Room, there were 35.29% of the participants. Penguin Room had 35.29% participants. Wolf Room had 23.53% participants, and Kangaroo Room had 5.88% participants in our study. We also looked at who was receiving or who had received speech therapy and occupational therapy. And then we also looked in their evaluation reports that were done when they were taken in and reviewed for the program at the center. And we looked at who was reported as a picky eater and who was not. So 50.82% of the participants, it wasn't reported whether they were a picky eater or not. 35.29% were reported as a picky eater, and 5.88% it was reported that they were not a picky eater. Okay, so this slide just talks about the study procedure, specifically about what the study design was. So this was a pre-post study design where the success rate of the acceptance of new foods during the first rotation of tasting time was compared to the success rate of the acceptance of new foods during the second rotation of tasting time. So if you look at the tasting time rotation 1 on the left-hand side of the slide, it shows that there are 9 different foods that we looked at. So the kids were exposed to apples, oats, cheese, potatoes, bananas, bread, yogurt and pudding, pasta, and then tomatoes and rice. So these were the 9 new foods that were presented, and then each of these were presented for 2 weeks. And again, that's because research shows that children often need about 20 exposures to a new food before they're willing to try it. So apples were presented for weeks 1 and 2, followed by oats for the next 2 weeks, followed by cheese for the next 2 weeks, and then so on. So then all of those 9 foods were presented again during tasting time rotation 2. So we did the same 9 foods and presented them for 2 weeks. And this was just because we wanted to see if there was an increase in the acceptance of new foods now having been previously exposed to and familiar with those foods. So then I'm going to just go into our inclusion criteria and how we decided who was going to be included in this study and who was not. So in order to be included in the study, you needed to be diagnosed with autism. You needed to attend the Center for Autism for treatment from September 8th, 2015 to August 26th, 2016, and that's just because that's the full program year. The participants needed to remain in the same program room from the beginning and end of that same program year. And then also the Bambi 1, which I'll explain a little bit later. The Bambi is one of the outcome measures we used. So the first Bambi needed to be completed before January 2016, just to leave enough time to see if there was a difference in their scores when we did the Bambi again at the end of the year. So all participants, we obtained informed consent from all participants as well. So this just shows our flow chart for how we decided who was going to be included in the study. So at the top, you can see that there were 28 total participants that were included in the study at the beginning, but then 11 were removed for different reasons. So 5 were removed because they changed program rooms during that 2015 to 2016 program year. 2 were removed because their Bambi, the first one, was not completed by January 2016. And then 4 were removed because they were discharged during the 2015 to 2016 program year. So then that left us with the 17 total participants that met inclusion criteria, and that's why our N is 17. So I'm going to go into the 2 outcome measures that we use to track data and progress for the tasting time performance measure. So I'm abbreviating it as the TTPM for the rest of the presentation, just to kind of make it short. So the purpose of the TTPM was to measure participant success rate with the acceptance of new foods in the tasting time program. So the TTPM was developed based on those expectations the tasting time committee created for each participant working in tasting time. So those expectations were the ones that Chris had mentioned earlier in the beginning of this presentation. So for measurement, the TTPM was completed for each participant at the end of each 2-week new food presentations, which was about 20 food exposures. So that's our estimation of what 2 weeks in programming would be. So for example, if the week was apples, the child will be exposed to apples for the 2 weeks, and then at the end of those 2 weeks, the therapist would complete a TTPM for apples. And then what we did was we compared each participant's success rate during rotation 1 of tasting time to rotation 2 of tasting time to determine if there was an overall improvement in the acceptance of new foods. So on the next slide, this is what the tasting time performance measure looked like. And again, this is something that we had created based on the expectations of tasting time, what it would look like to be successful in tasting time. So you can see that there are 9 different items, and for each item, the therapist had to circle yes, no, or NA. So yes, a therapist would circle yes if the behavior occurred, no if the behavior did not occur, and NA if the behavior did not apply to that child. So in order to get their success rate, we would add up all of the yeses that the participant got, divided by 9 because there's 9 items, and then multiplied by 100 just to get the rate. So we did this for all the different 9 foods during rotation 1, and then again during rotation 2. And that's how we got their success rate scores. So the next outcome measure is the Bambi. So this is the Brief Autism Mealtime Behavior Inventory. And this is the first standardized measure to examine mealtime behavior specifically in children with autism. and this was developed by Lukens and Lynchid in 2008. So the Bambi is the first assessment to address feeding problems often observed in the autism population, whereas previous measures did not capture feeding problems typically seen in children with autism, such as mealtime self-injury, aggression, rituals, and food selectivity features. So we wanted to include the Bambi in our tasting time study to obtain the family caregiver perspective in our study. So we wanted to see, did caregivers notice a change in mealtime behaviors at home now that their child has been participating in tasting time? And then also if they noticed that skills that were learned in tasting time were being generalized to the settings outside of the Center for Autism. So are they being generalized to home, restaurants, or other places in the community? So for the measurement, the Bambi was completed with the caregiver at the participant's first and final treatment plan meeting. So the first treatment plan meeting, that was when Bambi 1 was done, and the final treatment plan meeting was when Bambi 2 was done. So families and caregivers of the participants completed the Bambi with the occupational therapist. The speech therapist or family consultant or the team captain would be, they would act as a backup data collector if the OT was not available. It was attempted to control for the same rater and the same caregiver to rate the behavior on both the Bambi and Bambi 2. However, due to programmatic issues and family conflicts, this was not possible. So then what we did was we compared their first Bambi and their final Bambi to see if there were any changes in mealtime behaviors. So the way the Bambi works is if the overall Bambi score is high, that means there's a high amount of disruptive mealtime behaviors. If the Bambi score is low, that means that there's a low rate of disruptive mealtime behaviors. So we wanted to compare each participant's Bambi 1 and Bambi 2 scores to see if there was an improvement in mealtime behavior. And if there was an improvement in mealtime behavior, that would be indicated by having a lower Bambi 2 score, because lower means that there's less disruptive mealtime behaviors. So I'm going to just go to the next slide. So this shows what the Bambi looks like. So you can see that there are 18 different items. This is meant for children 3 to 11 years old. And parents would rate each item using a 5-point Likert scale to assess their child's variety of foods eaten, food refusal, and their child's demonstration of autism features. So I'm going to move into the data. So back to our questions from before, we wanted to look at acceptance of new foods and mealtime behaviors. So for acceptance of new foods, our question was, is there an increase in acceptance of new foods after participating in tasting time? We hypothesized that there is a statistically significant increase in the acceptance of new foods after participating in tasting time. So what we did was we did a one-tailed paired t-test to compare the success rate of acceptance of new foods during tasting time rotation 1, and that's indicated by TTPM1, the lighter green box, and tasting time rotation 2, which is indicated by TTPM2, which is the darker green box. So there was not a significant difference in the success rate during tasting time rotation 1, with a mean of 62.31 and a standard deviation of 15.96, and tasting time rotation 2 with a mean of 62.97 and a standard deviation of 17.96. When we looked at changes in mealtime behavior, our question was, is there an increase in improvement in mealtime behaviors after participating in tasting time? So we hypothesized that there would be a statistically significant improvement in mealtime behaviors after participating in tasting time. So we did a one-tailed paired t-test to compare the rated mealtime behaviors before, at the beginning of tasting time, and after they participated in tasting time. So Bambi 1 was done in the beginning, Bambi 2 was done at the end. So we found that there was not a significant difference in mealtime behaviors rated at the beginning of tasting time, so with a mean of 43 and a standard deviation of 9.6, and after participating in tasting time with a mean of 47.65 and a standard deviation of 13.91. So what can we conclude? So when we think about the acceptance of new foods, our findings demonstrate an overall improvement in rated acceptance of new foods when comparing tasting time rotation 1 to tasting time rotation 2 success rate, with a slight increase in the average rate during tasting time rotation 2. However, these findings are not statistically significant. So these findings are not agreeing with what our study predictions were, and that could be for a variety of different reasons. One of them could be related to the changes in the TTPM raters. So therapists rating the TTPM1 and TTPM2 varied throughout the program year due to staff turnover and other programmatic changes. And it was intended to have the same rater from the start to the finish of the study, but that was not possible. So since inter-rater reliability was not established for the TTPM, changes in therapists could have impacted the way a participant's success was rated in rotation 1 compared to rotation 2. So there could have been under or over reporting of success rates depending upon which therapist completed the TTPM1 and the TTPM2. Reliability and validity were not established for the TTPM, therefore it's unclear if this measure is truly capturing participants' success rate in tasting time. Changes and routine in the environment. So throughout the year, therapists in the program room change. And we know that changes in routine and the environment can impact children who have autism. So while participants remained in the same program room throughout the program year, it could be that the changes in the program room therapists were disruptive and impacted participants' ability to participate in tasting time. And then last, the variations in tasting time strategies used could have impacted our findings. So while the new food presentation activities were created to introduce new foods similarly across programs and sites, the strategies that each program room used were not controlled for or tracked. So therapists had the freedom to select the types of strategies that they wanted to use within the new food presentation activities. So perhaps some therapists were better able to effectively choose strategies to promote participant success in tasting time compared to others. And then when we look at mealtime behaviors, our findings demonstrate an overall worsening of rated mealtime behaviors when comparing Bambi 1 scores to Bambi 2 scores, with an increase in the rated Bambi 2 scores. So because Bambi 2 increased, that means there was more disruptive behaviors that were being reported according to the Bambi 2. These findings are not statistically significant. The findings also do not agree with what our study predictions were. It actually shows the opposite of what we expected. We expected to see improvements, and this is showing worsening of behaviors. So, we were wondering why that might be. So one thought is that is related to the changes in the caregiver raters. So caregivers rating the Bambi 1 and Bambi 2 varied throughout the program year due to family conflicts and programmatic changes. So there could have been under or over reporting of mealtime behaviors depending upon that particular caregiver's perspective. There were also changes in Bambi data collectors. So the data collectors for the Bambi varied throughout the program year. Some items on the Bambi required explanations from data collectors to help the caregiver raters understand the question. Therefore, different data collectors could have explained the items in different ways to the same caregiver rater, thereby potentially impacting the way the caregiver rated the participant's behavior. So it could have also been possible that some caregivers did not understand the items on the Bambi, but felt uncomfortable asking for clarifications and proceeded to answer the question in a way that didn't truly reflect the participants' mealtime behaviors. And then lastly, it could have been that there may have not been enough time that passed between completing Bambi 1 and Bambi 2 to really measure that change in their mealtime behaviors. You might have needed more time to really see an effect. Okay, so lastly, we're going to just talk about the limitations and future directions of our study. So some limitations, we had a really small sample size with an N of 17. We used a convenience sample of individuals with autism from one treatment center in one region of the country, so we're not getting a truly inclusive representation of individuals with autism. No baseline of food intake was established prior to participation in tasting time, so it would have been helpful to know what a child's diet looked like before beginning tasting time and use more formal assessments to track and determine who is a picky eater. There was lack of a typically developing control group for comparison. It would have been helpful to have a typically developing control group to compare success rates with and without tasting time intervention. And we also lack demographic information on the caregivers and families. So socioeconomic status could have impacted a participant's success in tasting time. For example, limited exposure to new foods or familiarity with new foods at home due to finances and accessibility to grocery stores. So some future directions. There should be studies that are using a larger sample size of children diagnosed with autism, maybe a more representative sample from different parts of the country. Studies that obtain a baseline of food intake prior to intervention could be really helpful. Studies that are better able to control for raters, data collectors, etc. Potential revisions of the tasting time performance measure could be done to better capture what success looks like in tasting time. And then studies that further explore relationships. So what is the relationship between a child who is reported to be a picky eater and their success rate in tasting time? What is the relationship between success rates in tasting time and age? What is the relationship between success rates in tasting time and the program room that they were in? So these are further questions that we can explore and just get a better understanding of the program. So we would like to thank the following individuals for their continued support throughout this project. So the Center for Autism, our Tasting Time Committee, therapists and staff from Penguin, Tiger, Wolf, and Kangaroo Room during the 2015-2016 program year, our family consultants and assistant directors of the early childhood programs, and Kalina and Eva, who helped with statistics. So thank you for listening to our presentation. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions. This is all of our contact information, our emails and phone numbers. So yeah, thank you.